For I know how many are your offenses and how great your sins. There are those who oppress the innocent and take bribes, and deprive the poor of justice in the courts. The book of Amos is set in the 8th century BCE, and while Amos is from the southern kingdom of Judah, his audience is the northern kingdom of Israel. For those who need a quick refresher, King David was the one to unite Israel and Judah as one kingdom. David was succeeded as king by his son Solomon. And after Solomon died, the kingdoms split, forming the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, which is the setting of Amos and his time. In today's text from Amos, we see a recognition of the greatness of God as creator, and we see God's reprimand of people who let justice go by the wayside, living comfortable and unjust lives. We also see God declining the worship and sacrifice the people of Israel offer, not because their worship and sacrifice is done incorrectly, but because their behavior, their way of life, is a foul stench to God. So you may ask, what does this have to do with us? Do we not collect food for the hungry, help build houses for people who don't have them, and participate in many good and helpful acts through Springdale's mission programs? Yes, it is true that Springdale has a great mission program, and that many good things are done, and this mission program is very important to many, many people. However, here we must differentiate when it comes to mission between acts of charity and acts of justice, for both can fall under the umbrella of mission within the church. In our current Western culture, we love charity, especially in the church. Charity, which is giving clothes to those who are naked, collecting food for food pantries, helping volunteer at homeless shelters, giving money to disaster relief efforts, and other acts which are given to provide for the needy. These acts, while good, are but bandages on festering wounds. We can give a person a fish so that he has something to eat, but this does not address the reason why he is hungry in the first place and has nothing to eat. If we go and volunteer in soup kitchens and collect food for food pantries every day for the rest of our lives, it may put food in people's stomachs, but it does nothing to address why people are hungry and without food in the first place. Charity is good, but it is only a temporary fix. Soup kitchens, food stamps, food pantries may help feed people, but they don't end hunger permanently. So if charity is but a bandage, then justice is more like surgery. It is the operation needed so that the festering wounds can be healed. Justice is where questions regarding problems like hunger and racism and so many others are addressed. Justice is when the systems that keep people uneducated, in poverty, and without access to basic resources, necessities, and rights are dismantled. After God's tirade against the worship of the people of Israel, Amos uses the image of a river that flows unfailingly. For justice is not a leaky tap, but a raging river flowing on for eternity. There are 780 million people around the world who lack access to clean water. There are more than 3 million people that die each year worldwide from vaccine-preventable diseases. 15% of the 313.9 million people that make up the population of the United States live in poverty. 38.2% of United States children in poverty are African American, which is the highest of any racial group. 14,827 people were murdered in the United States in the year 2012 alone. And now there are Nigerian people who are being dragged into the streets and beaten nearly to death, others burned alive because of the further criminalization of the gay community in Nigeria. These are but a few statistics that express the great injustices present in our world today. We could go on and mention statistics on imprisonment, integration, immigration, lack of access to education, health care, and basic resources. We could talk about every ism under the sun. But the problem isn't always that we don't know that these injustices exist. Rather, it is that we, like the people of Israel, that the prophet Amos is speaking to, are not always upholding justice for the stranger, for the oppressed, and for those whom Jesus called the least of these. So where does this leave us? What are we going to do to break down dams keeping rivers of justice from flowing? What systems of injustice do we see in our own midst and around our world today? Are we doing anything at all? As Amos chastises the people of the northern kingdom of Israel for accepting bribes, participating in unfair tax policies, and oppressing the innocent, so too are we being called out for our participation in systems of oppression and injustice. Whenever we call the poor lazy for wanting a raise in wages, when they are working multiple minimum wage jobs just to put some semblance of food on the table, we are participating in systems of injustice. Every time we blame a woman who was raped for that rape because of the clothing she was wearing, instead of blaming the rapist, we are participating in systems of injustice. Whenever we continue to support companies that have bad track records for labor and environmental policies, we are participating in unjust systems. This list could go on and on and on. Unless we think we are not active in these systems, turning a blind eye to those injustices makes us just as culpable as those actively participating in their perpetuation. We must continue works of charity that we already do. For charity is clearly commanded by God, as we saw in the passage from Matthew, where Jesus says that whenever we feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, visit the sick or the imprisoned, we are feeding and giving drink to and visiting Jesus himself. However, we are not called to do charity alone, for Amos calls us to do works of justice, a justice so strong that it will rage like an ever-flowing stream. We are called to do a justice that breaks down the dams of racism, hunger, poverty, homophobia, sexism, violence, and all other dams that hold back the waters of justice. Working for justice is not always easy, and it is not always comfortable. Working for justice has gotten people like Martin Luther King Jr. killed, and people like Rosa Parks and so many others imprisoned. And yet we too are called to justice. I cannot tell you what you may have to give up in order to help bring about justice. I don't even know what I may be called to give up in order to bring about justice. But we are all called to give everything that we have and everything that we are to God, so that justice may roll like an unfailing stream. For if we do not do work that leads to justice, all of this, all of our songs, our prayers, our words of peace, our offerings, our sermons, are a stench in the nose of God. So today, will our worship be a stench in God's nose, or will it be a sweet, sweet perfume? And if ever we find that our worship becomes a stench in God's nose, perhaps it is time to stop applying bandage after bandage after bandage to festering wounds of injustice, and instead take those wounds so that they may be healed and stink no more.